especial bienvenida. Es la segunda jornada de este encuentro anual de educación superior con el tema Tendencias Internacionales en la Educación Superior y la Profesión Académica. Hoy estamos mirando algunos rostros que no estaban ayer. Eso, por supuesto, nos estimula porque nos convence de que somos más. Vamos a tener 2 conferencias centrales. Después de cada conferencia vamos a tener la perspectiva local y después de la perspectiva local, entonces vamos a trabajar en ese momento interactivo. Es muy útil que recordemos que se ha incluido en las carpetas formularios para escribir las inquietudes, para escribir las preguntas. Personal de apoyo pasa buscando esas preguntas que entonces son entregadas al equipo de moderación. Y ese equipo de moderación entonces aprovecha para enriquecer lo que acá se ponga en común con las conferencias centrales. Teniendo esto claro, vamos a trabajar recordando la utilidad, la ventaja de usar el tiempo con alto criterio de eficiencia. Hoy vamos a invertir el orden, entonces vamos a comenzar con el doctor Phillip Altbach. Él es profesor emérito del Boston College y hoy nos va a hablar sobre la profesión académica en la educación superior. Va a compartir con nosotros un enfoque comparado. Recibamos a Phillip Altbach.
Buenos días, and thank you all for coming back for the second day of this really interesting and I think very important conference. I think it's quite brilliant of the organizers today to have chosen the academic profession as the topic of this morning's discussion, because without any question, it is the academic profession which is the key to the success of higher education everywhere. And too often, many of those in charge of higher education all around the world ignore the key ingredient to the success of our enterprise, and that is the teachers, the academic profession. So it's very important that we focus on that. With my complete expertise on this country, after now a day and a half, I am fully aware that the academic profession here faces tremendous challenges. And what I'm going to discuss this morning is not the Dominican Republic, but global observations and realities which I think will affect your situation, or at least are elements that you must think about. And I will conclude, if I have a little bit of time, with some international examples. I know my colleague Antonio will focus on Europe in the same respect, so we can get a more in-depth analysis from him. I am not going to be presenting a very happy picture, because the academic profession everywhere is in trouble. Not just here, but in different ways, in different contexts, in different countries. The academic profession faces severe problems and a general deterioration in the terms and conditions of academic work. This is very much related to our topic of yesterday, massification, but it also relates to changing attitudes by governments and others concerning the academic profession. I could say, but I would be wrong, that this is a product of the current wave of intolerance and disrespect for ideas and for intellectuals. That is the case in many countries, including the United States under Mr. Trump. But that's not true, because this deterioration has been going on for some time in the US and elsewhere. So with that unhappy thought, let me start out by pointing out in the American context how I think that the academic profession is now in something of a crisis. So I'll take the United States as a brief example. Traditionally, in the US, when a person finished his or her doctorate, and most academics in the university and college sector have PhDs, very much unlike in this country, he or she got a what we call tenure track job. I know many of you have been educated in the US and know all this, so forgive me if I'm repeating what you know. They competed on an open market for a tenure track job. They got that job, if they were lucky, as an assistant professor, and worked their way up the system, eventually getting tenure, which in the US is difficult to do and requires quite a serious evaluation of both teaching and research, depending on the focus of the institution. And many people didn't get tenure and had to find another job, because if you don't get a permanent appointment, then you have to leave. That's the way it used to be. Now, more than half the new positions in American higher education are not on the tenure track at all. And I'm not talking about part-timers who dominate your system and increasingly are important in our system also, but I'm talking about full-time academics who are appointed now on a contract system where they have no security of a job after a certain period of time, 3 years or 5 years, generally speaking. Depending on the terms of the contract, they can be renewed again for only a period of time, but they don't have the security of tenure that they used to have. In a way, we have also seen the expansion of part-time academic appointments, what I've called and other people have called the Latin Americanization of North American higher education. And this is not a good thing for us. It's also not a good thing for you. But increasingly, it's the reality. And of course, like here, we can pay people a relatively modest amount of money to teach a course or two. And if next semester the course doesn't have enough students or the focus of the department changes, they're out. They're not hired again. And of course, and I'll argue this later, you cannot build a successful academic institution on the basis of part-time appointments. That's just reality. So you have to have people who are full-time. They don't necessarily have to be tenured in our context, but they have to be full-time. We have seen a deterioration in salaries for academics. Still in the United States, if you're a full-time academic in most institutions, you can live a middle-class lifestyle, more or less, maybe not in Boston, but in some parts of the country where the cost of living is not so high, on the basis of your academic salary. You don't have to have other jobs, as is common or maybe even universal in this country and in many other countries. But we've seen a deterioration in salaries for the academic profession. When we compare academic salaries with similar salaries for other highly trained individuals working outside the university, academics in all disciplines, even highly paid disciplines like computer science, engineering, and law, don't make as much as their colleagues outside the academic institution. So trying to attract the best and the brightest to the university is increasingly difficult, particularly in our top universities that have a research mission and that are competing in the global rankings and wanting to be world-class places. So when they are looking for staff, they have trouble finding the best ones. And I think that's true everywhere in the world these days. In the United States, in many fields, we now see an overproduction of PhDs, not in all fields, not in engineering, not in a number of STEM areas, but in humanities and some social sciences, we see that. And we're trying to deal with that by preparing our PhDs for alternative jobs, jobs which are not necessarily in universities. Traditionally, as you know, if you studied for a PhD, you went into the academic profession, and increasingly that's no longer the case. In some fields because of oversupply, in other fields like computer science, artificial intelligence, and so on, because of tremendous demand from outside the universities. So we see a significant change in the job prospects and job directions for academics. And many of our universities and departments are trying to prepare our PhD students for alternative careers. It's a kind of major focus at the moment. The demographics of the academic profession almost everywhere are changing. Large numbers of faculty who were hired during the period of mass expansion in the 60s and 70s and 80s of the last century are now retiring. You can see before you one case of that. And so the nature of the profession is changing. And in a lot of countries facing financial pressure, the older and more experienced academics are either not being replaced by permanent appointees or are being replaced by young people, some of whom have very good ideas and some of whom are maybe less well trained. So my point is we are seeing serious demographic challenges and changes in the profession. All of this is not universally the case. In many developing countries, there are severe shortages of academics who are well qualified, or even academics at all. And in these countries, many academics are not well trained. And you can figure out how the Dominican Republic fits into that generalization, because I think overall what I just said is true here and needs to be thought about a lot. So as I said, a key global challenge is how to attract the best and the brightest to the academic profession. And you're not going to do that by underpaying people. You're not going to do that by insisting that they teach 40 hours a week. You may have, in this country, would be interesting to do some research, there is none about this, you may have the highest average teaching load in the world, in the Dominican Republic. That is not a nice thing to have, if it's the case. Certainly, it's one of the highest. And you're not going to attract the best with that kind of teaching load. And you're not going to attract the best unless you can offer them a stable, full-time career. So, what are the, well, let me say one other general point. Most academics in the world are teachers. They're not researchers. And too often, this is true in America as it is in many countries, we evaluate academics in general for the quality of their research. And we want them to do some research, even in universities which are mainly focused on teaching. And as I said yesterday, I do believe that that's a mistake. We need to reward what most academics do in their careers, and that's teach. Part of the reason that we don't evaluate teaching as much as we should is because it's not so easy to do that. Evaluating research is easier. You just count the publications or the grants that they get or other kinds of clear productivity. For teaching, we are at the beginning, I think, of carefully and effectively evaluating the quality of teaching. Traditionally, in the US, we evaluated teaching by one metric alone, and that is student responses to the teaching of professors in their classroom. And that was all. We didn't have peer evaluation, we didn't videotape teaching performance, we didn't encourage people in any serious way to change their teaching methods. We just asked the students, is this guy or woman a good teacher? Yes, great. Yes, okay. No, and so on. That's a very poor way of evaluating teaching. And I'm not sure in the Dominican Republic if you do that, or indeed if you do anything. So we are at the verge of a small revolution in the evaluation of teaching in the United States. And this is true in many countries. The British are deeply engaged in changes in how teaching is evaluated. But we have a long way to go. And my point here is that that is central, because most academics indeed are teachers. So, what are the necessary ingredients of a successful professoriate? I'm going to go down a list and make a few comments, and you can see how those requirements fit into the local context here. And I don't mean at all to be critical of the Dominican Republic, because many countries fail. If you give a test on these requirements, many countries will fail the test, and the number of failures is going up around the world. So, you have to provide adequate salaries to support a middle-class lifestyle according to the standards of the particular country. You don't have to pay people necessarily competitive salaries to the top-paying countries, Canada, USA, and so on. I might point out that about a decade ago, colleagues at my center and at the economics department of the Higher School of Economics in Russia did a joint research study, we think the first one ever done, comparing average academic salaries in 28 countries. Dominican Republic was not one of them. And we found that in no country, we included the US, Canada, Germany, France, Japan, China, Russia, so on. A couple in Latin America, I think Argentina and one other one, Chile. And there were some methodological problems with the study because it was the first one. But we found that in no country were academics paid were paid competitively with other intellectual professions. No country. We found tremendous variation in the salary structures in different countries. Now, this was for full-time academics. And interestingly, the lowest paid countries, on average, were Russia and China. And the highest paid countries were the USA, Canada, and there was one other, I forget. And the rest, European countries, mostly in the middle. So you have to pay faculty members enough to live in a middle-class lifestyle so that they are not forced to moonlight, to have other jobs, which is totally common, maybe universal in this country. You have to have full-time appointments, not for everybody, but for a significant part of the academic profession, because you cannot build an effective university on the basis of part-timers. This is not a criticism of part-timers. Often they're great, and they're also important because they will bring a sense of the reality of real life, the other jobs that they may have, to the classroom. And in many fields, management studies, for example, that's very important. But you can't build a university on part-timers. They don't have the time, they don't have the commitment, they don't have the decision-making authority to participate in the basic life, culture, management of the university. So you have to have a significant core of full-time faculty. And I think it's the case in much of Latin America, not just here, but also here, that that's not the reality for most universities. You have to have a career structure. That would seem obvious, but in so many countries, it's not the case. In many places, once you're hired as a young lecturer or assistant professor or adjunct, depending on the country title, you have your job more or less for life. And you have that arrangement, and it's, to me, the worst combination of experiences. because on the one hand, in practical terms, the university is stuck with you. They will continue to employ you no matter your performance, unless you're really terrible. On the other hand, you as an academic have no security of tenure. So legally speaking, the institution can get rid of you either according to a contract expiration or at any time at all, which damages academic freedom. So you have to have a career structure with clear arrangements for how faculty are hired and promoted. I think there needs to be some kind of tenure system in the American sense of the term, or at least an assumption that you can have within your institution a permanent appointment based on your performance. Now, as many of you know, the U.S. tenure system, now applying only to half our profession, evaluates a person when they go from assistant to associate professor in a very significant way, and significant proportions, nationally about a third, don't make it, don't get tenure. Once you have tenure, the assumption is you can keep your job until you retire, although you're continually evaluated afterward. And we are taking what we call post-tenure review much more seriously than we used to. So there are serious evaluations. And this is quite important, your salary increases will depend on your performance in these evaluations, both before tenure and afterwards. So it's not just you get a free ride, automatic increases, every time salaries go up. So some kind of arrangement for appointments is very important. This protects, of course, academic freedom. It also, and this is quite interesting, but we have good data about this, it also permits the university to pay somewhat lower salaries than market rates because the professors have job security. So that's an advantage for them, because if they're out in industry, there is no such thing any place in any industry as tenure. So universities can offer better job security than industry does, and that's increasingly the case in an economy where people are constantly changing jobs. You have to have performance-based hiring, annual evaluations, and promotions based on performance, not just promotion based on seniority. And I do not know how the situation is in the Dominican Republic, but my guess from looking at research in many countries is that most places are still in the 21st century rewarding, increasing the salaries, providing additional contracts to academics based only on seniority, not based on performance. So if you're not doing something terrible, you continue. So you have to have performance. You have to have transparency in the criteria for evaluation. And you have to have, I think, salaries that are based on these evaluations, at least in part. So there has to be some carrots and some sticks for the academic profession. You have to have meritocracy throughout the system. And that has to be seen by everybody, so that you're not hiring your relatives, you're not promoting your friends, but you're looking at a meritocratic arrangement. You have to have teaching loads that are not too high, especially in universities that have a research mission. U.S. research universities, as many of you know, have a typical teaching load, what we say, classroom hours per week of about 6, some 9, occasionally 12, no more. That's for research-focused universities. Some teaching-focused institutions, community colleges, and some 4-year institutions have higher. But no one would dream of asking their faculty to spend 40 hours a week in the classroom. Impossible, because they would have no time to prepare new classes, to do any kind of thinking, to keep up with research, to participate in the governance and committee structures that are part of the university. So you have to have appropriate teaching responsibilities. And that depends, of course, on the mission of the university. Because, as I pointed out before, there is no uniform academic profession. Burton Clark, a famous American sociologist, a half-century ago, pointed out that academics have many careers, many lives, based on the different kinds of institutions, based on their own interests, based on the missions of where they worked. So you can't, as I'm now doing a little bit, you can't overgeneralize about the academic profession. You need to involve faculty in governance. In some countries, governance is very bureaucratic, top-down, not involving the professors or the teaching staff at all. That's a big mistake, both because the university needs to have a full participation from the faculty, and the idea of academic autonomy and academic freedom requires academics to be involved in the governance structure of the university. I am not arguing that the faculty members should have complete control. There needs to be some balance, I think, between the administration, which is composed of faculty members for the most part, and the professors themselves. And I think the best universities are ones that are not dominated by the administration and also not completely dominated by the professors. China, for example, which everybody looks at as the next academic superpower, has several serious problems internal to the university. One of them, of course, being a lack of academic freedom, but another one being tremendous over-bureaucratization of decision-making in all of the universities in China. So I think, this is not my subject for today, I think China is going to have something of what we call the glass ceiling of their dominance, maybe increased improvement in higher education, unless they can do some reforms internally to the university. And that's very difficult for them. But my main point is over-bureaucratization is not a good idea for the academic profession. As I said, the terms and conditions of academic work are deteriorating in many countries. In the countries that have a stable academic career structure, such as the US and the UK and a number of European countries, that structure is being weakened now, and that's a problem in the long run. Job security for professors is being weakened in many parts of the world. In some countries, there is no academic labor market, and there are few challenges for mobility among institutions. I think that's true here. It's one of the issues that's, in the Russian context, been concerning us greatly, because in Russia, traditionally, there's no national academic labor market and a tremendous amount of inbreeding. And I think you're also, when you're hearing me say this, you're saying, it's just like we have here in the Dominican Republic, that mostly graduates from a university get a job at that university and spend their whole career there. And if they're not satisfied with the job at that university, it's very difficult for them to get another job at another university, because it's just not part of the academic system in Russia and in many countries. We see an increasing bureaucratization of universities. In part, this is because of massification and the fact that the academic institutions have become essentially large corporations, and it's complicated to make sure that the academics are involved in the governance, but it's still very important. We've seen globally, and this was mentioned yesterday, the expansion of private higher education. And with the exception of the very small number of top private universities, and I know there are several in the Dominican Republic, many in the United States, and a few in other parts of the world, that have a structure which is quite similar to public institutions, and a kind of an ethic which is really academic in their nature. Most private universities around the world have no faculty governance, few full-time faculty, and are completely controlled by their owners, by their managing boards, and so on. So the rise of the private sector in higher education has been a very serious problem for the future of the academic profession, and where, as in almost all Latin American countries, as I mentioned, and certainly in this country, where the system is now dominated by the private sector, that is a serious problem, and one that the private institutions need to worry about, be concerned about, and develop an appropriate career structure and participation of their faculty members. Finally, let me mention briefly the emergence of a global academic labor market. When the universities, Western universities, were established back in the Middle Ages, we had a global academic market. In Europe, anyway, the language of instruction was Latin, so everybody could teach throughout European universities, and it was very common both for faculty members, professors, and students to go from one country to another. With the rise of national languages, and generally speaking, the nation state in Europe, by and large, that disappeared, and universities became more national institutions. Now, in the end of the 20th century and in the current century, we have again an international labor market with huge mobility among faculty members. Not much studied, but quite important, with the biggest numbers actually going from India and China to other parts of the world. We have statistics in the United States that when a student from India or China finishes their doctorate in an American university, about 75% of them stay in the United States, many going into the professoriate. So the number for China is going down. That is, more are returning home. And some Chinese and even a few Indian academics and some from other countries are lured back to their country later in their careers by high salaries and the development of good universities in China, India, and other places. But we have that academic labor market. And the academic labor market is actually quite complicated because we see mobility from European countries, especially the UK and Ireland, to the United States and Canada because salaries are better in the US. We see very little mobility in the other direction. In other words, very few American academics, although the number is going up because of our tight job market. We see tremendous mobility within, for example, the Middle East, which is not much studied, of scholars from Egypt and Palestine going to places like Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries. And we also see Indians and Pakistanis going from those countries to the Gulf countries and Saudi Arabia. So we see students, faculty members from sub-Saharan Africa going especially to South Africa, which is kind of the academic center for the continent. So we see lots of mobility, and it's not just the way we've traditionally thought about that academic mobility. Some countries have actively encouraged the return of their faculty, or, and this is what the Indians do a lot, encouraging, and for that matter also Ethiopia, encouraging their diasporas, which are quite big, to participate in local higher education, maybe by coming back, but mainly by some kind of joint arrangements. And I don't know if the Dominican Republic is thinking about this or even doing it, but it's a possibility for brain gain among highly trained people who have settled someplace else. And we found from the research that it's often impossible to get them to go back full-time. But it is practical to get them to go back part-time so that they can keep an appointment in one country and have maybe another appointment or academic work in a second country. So what I've tried to give you a sense of in this presentation is the necessities on the one hand, the practicalities on the other hand, and the needs on the third hand of the global academic profession. So let me stop at this point and ask for our brilliant additional comments. Thank you.